Earlier this morning, a storm blew through my area. It only lasted about 30 minutes, but it managed to take out a few trees and the electricity of most of the county. Sure, I was upset, but it could have been worse, I suppose. The weather was much cooler than I usually thought it was at this time of the summer, and I could charge my phone in my car and get Wi-Fi from McDonald's. Since it was about 6 o'clock, I decided to go out and grab some dinner, hoping my lights would be on when I returned. Much to my frustration, my street was still dark. Oh well, I guess I would finally get a good night's sleep. The power should be back in the morning. When I entered my living room, however, my TV was on. At first, I thought that maybe my electricity was working again, but it seemed that the TV was the only thing that would turn on. I knew that something was seriously wrong. I couldn't change the channel. In fact, none of the buttons worked. The TV seemed to be stuck on one station. My screen displayed a fuzzy, dim view of a driveway from what looked like security camera footage. The scene on TV looked familiar, but for some reason, I did not fully recognize it, and couldn't tell where it was being filmed. At the back of the frame, I was able to make out a figure. It appeared to be the grainy image of a woman shuffling across the street with her head down, rivers of dark, matted hair flowing over her obscured face. She stumbled a little and didn't seem to lift her feet all the way off the ground when she walked, instead letting the tips of her toes drag before taking another step. I thought she might have been drunk, but I got the feeling that something more sinister was going on. The woman was wearing a dark, ratty t-shirt and jeans. She was barefoot. The loose fabric hanging on her small frame swayed gently in the lingering breeze outside. Suddenly, she made a 90-degree turn and walked halfway up the driveway in the video. She was now facing the camera head-on, and she just stopped mid-step. She slowly started to lift her head, and as her hair parted, more of her face was revealed to the camera. She had normal-looking skin and hair. In fact, everything except her eyes and mouth was perfectly ordinary. Like I said before, the video quality wasn't great, but I was able to clearly see that her eyes looked like they were about ready to pop out of her head. They bulged grotesquely out of their sockets, so far I didn't know how they stayed in place. While her eyes were disturbing, her mouth was one of the most unnerving things I had ever seen in my life. It reminded me of those old war movies where they showed soldiers who had survived bombings. Her lower jaw had been torn clean off her skull, a bloody gaping maw that was all that remained. Hundreds of tiny, pointed teeth poked out from her swollen and irritated gums. A car drove down the street behind the woman, the headlights illuminating her mangled face and swaying figure. When I recognized my neighbor's car pulling into the driveway of the house next door, it clicked. The footage was coming from my security cameras outside. They were already set up when I moved in a couple months ago, but I never paid for the service, so I assumed they didn't work. I didn't understand how any of this was possible. The woman could not have been a human being, at least not completely, and my TV, or the camera for that matter, should not have been working. There was no electricity for them to use. In the midst of my rising panic, I barely noticed the woman beginning to move forward towards my house. She stepped onto my porch, opened my front door, my locked front door, with ease, and walked right inside. I froze, bracing myself for the familiar click of the doorknob turning and the slight creaking of the hinges as it swung open, but only silence followed. Once I forced myself to open my eyes, I saw that the front door remained tightly closed and locked, as I always left it. I turned back to the TV screen. The driveway was empty, and the woman was gone. Even though I couldn't think of a way for it to work, I hoped all this was a practical joke. I prayed one of my friends would jump out from behind the couch and give me a heart attack, telling me how much of an idiot I was, how he totally got me. But that did not happen, and I was left with only the other option that what's happening to me was somehow real. I furiously started pushing buttons on the TV, thinking that maybe one of them would do something. I would much rather have the mangled woman still standing in front of the camera. I couldn't take not knowing where she was. My racing mind and pounding heart came screeching to a halt when a disc popped out of the DVD player. I was watching a recording. When I was in college, I worked several summers at a camp in the mountains of North Carolina. This was a Christian mission camp, where middle and high school youth would come in with their youth leaders to do projects for people in need. They would pay to come to one of the 5 camps in western North Carolina and spend a week going to different homes in the area, doing things like building wheelchair ramps, painting, cleaning yard work, etc. It was a really great experience for me and the volunteers, and I loved every minute of it. I have a few scary stories from my years as a camp counselor, but one of them stands out the most. It was my 3rd year on staff. I was a camp director, which meant I was in charge of a staff of 7 people. I made sure the camp budget was in order, the food shipment made it, and everyone else was doing their respective jobs. It was my favorite position on staff, because I could delegate anything I wanted to anyone else, and then relax in the nice mountain air for a while. When responsibility kicked in, though, it could be rough. The mountains of North Carolina are nice in the summertime, but the nights can still be upwards of 90 degrees during certain weeks. When you live in a small building with no insulation and 8 people, it can get very hot. We did have a window unit that would bring the temperature down to a reasonable degree, so we could sleep peacefully. It was a Saturday night when I woke up, covered in sweat. I had kicked my blanket off sometime in the night, but that wasn't enough. I couldn't hear the window unit in the next room, so the air must not be on. I got up and grabbed my flashlight and went to turn it back on. Nothing. The clock wasn't even working, so I figured we must have tripped a breaker somehow. It happened regularly when we had too many phones or appliances plugged in. I made my way to the breaker box and flipped a couple, but nothing was happening. It was about 2 a.m. and I was exhausted, so I laid back down thinking I would just deal with it in the morning. As soon as I laid down, though, I noticed how dark it actually was. I realized the power to the entire camp must be out. Oh well, I was tired and went back to sleep. Campers were coming in the morning and there was no power. The food in the fridge wouldn't stay good for long and we couldn't even cook anything. I was fully awake now and searching for the camp phone. Of course, there was no cell service at this camp, so all we had was a landline. The phone in staff quarters were cordless and required a charge. I found it, but it was already dead. I was getting more angry, thinking about what I'd have to deal with in the morning if I didn't fix the problem right then. No food, chaotic scramblings of trying to feed 50 people with no power or cell service. Reluctantly, I grabbed my keys and jumped in my truck. I headed for the only other phone in the camp. It wasn't cordless, so I knew it would be working. The downside was that it was located in the tool shed, a half-mile down the road at the entrance to the camp. The shed is set a little ways into the woods, off the main camp road. There were some old logging roads that wound through the campgrounds from the 1960s. They were mostly grown over, but some were kept open when the camp was formed to be used as access to certain campsites. The shed was positioned on a fork in the logging roads, each road going off into the blackness of the woods. I parked my truck with the lights pointed at the shed and proceeded to call the camp caretaker Donnie. No answer. I called repeatedly, but nothing. By this point, I'm getting very aggravated with the circumstances. I didn't know who the power company was in the area, and I didn't know what else to do. I'm about to call my parents to wake them up and ask for some help when I hear some rustling in the woods off to the right. I try to ignore it, thinking it was just a squirrel or bird, but it continued for a good 30 seconds. When it finally stopped, I realized it had emerged from the woods and was standing on the old grassy road. I waited for the sound to continue across the road to the woods on the other side, but there was only silence. There was a light on the power pole near the shed that usually kept the area lit, but it was off and I couldn't see anything past the bright headlights of my truck. I brushed it off. I had bigger problems and I couldn't let some noise in the woods freak me out. I finally called my parents and woke them up. They tried to help me by Googling numbers I could call for assistance. I wrote them down and let them get back to bed. There was nothing else they could do right then. It was about 3 at this point, and I'd accepted the fact that it was my job to get this camp running no matter what. I called the first number, a power outage assistance line, but got no answer. The next 2 numbers were no longer in service. They must not have been updated on their websites. I was at the last number on the list, and praying that I'd get some kind of answer as to why the power was out and when it would come back on. I dialed it and waited for it to ring. The first ring was normal, but the second one had a lot of feedback and static. Right after the third ring, there was a loud buzzing, and then pop. And I saw a light come on, way down the road at the main cabin. Finally. I watched as the lights throughout camp came on in the span of a couple seconds. In those couple of seconds, I was so relieved. I could finally go back to sleep and not worry about the food for the next day. Elated, I got up and started walking to my truck as the light on the power pole near the shed finally flicked on. There was a figure on the road. I froze in my tracks. All I saw was the silhouette of a man about 50 feet away, tall, wide, standing broad, and turned either towards me or away from me. I couldn't tell. I snapped out of it, jumped in my truck, and floored it back to the staff quarters. The cordless phone was still dead, so I woke up everyone and told them to get dressed and get in the car. We were going to find some cell service. On our way out of camp, I glanced at the shed as I sped past. The figure was gone. We reached a spot a few miles down the road where we finally had service and called the police. They came and searched the area but found nothing. The camp was just on the other side of the hill from some private residences, but they were all families with small kids. No one who really fit the psycho killer archetype. The rest of the summer went by fast. We didn't have any more weird occurrences, but when this happened, there was only 2 weeks left in the summer. I didn't remember the noise in the woods until later. It still creeps me out, realizing someone just walked out of the woods and just stood there, 50 feet away, watching for almost an hour, waiting for me to walk back into the dark. Ever since I was a child, I've had 2 big fears: darkness and silence. I could always pull through one by itself, but if the two were together, I would have a complete breakdown. While my parents tried their best to find the cause of my problems, they failed and ultimately did the next best thing. They bought me a fan. Every night, I would make sure to turn it on before hitting the lights. I started to become addicted to it, to the point where my family couldn't go on trips because of the lack of noise in hotel rooms. Then one night, the power went out. Around the time I was 16, a particularly bad storm hit the small town by the name of Hingham that I lived in at the time. Hingham was around during the colonial times, meaning most of the houses were very old, mostly made of wood, and very, very creaky. The main problem that tends to come up in situations like this is that every little noise will make me jump out of my skin. My parents were away for the weekend, out to visit an old family friend that had just been diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. My older brother was staying at a friend's house for the time being, so my grandparents were coming to take care of me for the weekend. I tried to convince my parents that I was old enough to take care of myself and that I didn't need anyone to watch after me. But deep down I was secretly glad they weren't leaving me by myself for the weekend. Since my grandparents couldn't make it right away, I would spend Friday night by myself and they'd arrive in the morning. When the first flash of darkness spread across the room, I thought nothing of it. Storms do that after all. Normally for us, they'll do that a few times, maybe cut out for a minute or so, and then all would continue as if nothing had happened. After the first flash came, a second, and then a third arrived. And then just darkness. I didn't panic since I knew that would come back on in a short time. After 5 minutes, I started to get worried. I tried to focus my mind on something else, but when the power goes out, it's hard to pin my attention on any technology, since it runs on the power which there wasn't any of. Even though it was still relatively early, I decided to get some sleep. The absolute last thing I'd want is to get to the point where it's so late that I wouldn't be able to see anything even without the storm. I pulled the covers high over my head and tried to force myself to sleep. That's when I started to hear the tapping. It was soft at first, and I originally thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It quickly grew louder, and I desperately tried to convince myself it was just the patter of the rain on the window, but it was too far rhythmic to be just rain. The taps went in this sequence: short, long, short, 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 long, long, short. It progressively got louder and louder, to the point where I could easily hear it over the storm. I reached for the phone to call the police, but my cellular data signal is weak where I live, and the Wi-Fi was down thanks to the storm. Suddenly it stopped. I could hear creaking as something moved down the stairs. My dog. My heart skipped a beat when I remembered about my dog. He was as big of a coward when it came to storms. Normally you can hear him whining throughout the entire house, but I hadn't heard him. I absolutely hated myself for this, but I knew I couldn't just leave him down there without making sure if he was okay. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on my nightstand, the baseball bat I kept next to my bed just in case, and slipped on my shoes. Better safe than sorry. As I made my way down to the first floor, I started to hear the tapping again. Short, long, short, 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 long, long, short. But this time it was coming from behind me. I spun around, only to find myself looking back up the stairs. I finally made my way down to the bottom and peeked around the corner in the kitchen. Nothing. My house was small and I had a big dog, so it shouldn't be that hard to miss, but I couldn't find it. I crept into the living room and noticed the door leading down to the storm cellar was wide open. With still no sign of my dog, I tiptoed down the creaky old stairs down to the basement. On the third step from the top, I almost slipped and fell down the rest of the stairs. I was extremely reluctant to look down, but I had to. It shouldn't be that hard to guess what I had found. Blood. Not a lot on that particular step, but more, and more as they went down. The way my house was set up, you couldn't see directly into the basement from the top of the stairs. You had to go all the way down. When I reached the bottom step, I shone my flashlight around the room slowly, and my blood ran cold when I saw my dog caged up, bloody, and beaten. The next thing I noticed was someone standing near him, wringing its hands. It appeared to be getting ready for a meal. I stepped back onto the stair behind me, and the staircase let out a very large sigh. Whatever it was very quickly spun around to face me. At first, I thought it had just spun around in a full circle. I was horrified to realize that it had no facial features, except for a large rotten hole in the center of its face, filled with maggots, and jagged teeth stuck out at random places. It charged at me, and with less than a second to spare, I swung at it with my bat. Either I was inhumanly strong, or it was extremely light, because it got flung down. It sat there dazed, presumably trying to regain its hand-eyeless coordination. I ran over to my dog and effortlessly opened the cage, as it was the one he slept in as a puppy, and I had lots of practice taking him out. I grabbed him by the collar and guided him through the house right out the front door. At this point I let go, and we ran over and banged on my neighbor's door until someone answered. They took one look at my frightened state and my dog's battered body, and immediately ushered us in. I explained what had happened, and while he obviously thought I was crazy, he nonetheless agreed to call the police and allowed me to spend the night at his house until my grandparents showed up. When they finally arrived the next morning, I ran over and hugged them, which I hadn't done since I was about 9. I explained to them exactly what happened. While they didn't think I was as crazy as my neighbor did, they didn't exactly think the whole story was true either. I made them come down to explore the basement with me, but whatever had been there was long gone. The small basement window was smashed from the inside, and there was a trail of blood leading into the woods. After months of intense therapy to get over what I had seen, I finally regained my comfortability in being in my own home. Until a few days ago, I decided to take a survival class to see if there was any skills that I could use to defend myself, in case I was ever in a situation like that again. One of the topics was Morse code. We all got a worksheet with useful phrases, and we had to practice writing the dots and dashes and tapping them out. I was particularly struggling with this one, so I lagged behind. When I was on the code for help, the person next to me made a very familiar sequence of taps. Short, long, short, 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 long, long, short. I just sat there frozen for a minute, and then once I regained composure, I asked him what that was. His response was one word: run. To this day, I still have no idea what could have warned me about the sequence of events that followed the power outage. All I know is that if a situation like this ever arises for me again, I'll be prepared. But right now I'm starting to get worried. The storm outside is starting to get more and more intense, and I haven't heard my dog whine. Hey everyone, Dismal Hero here, and I'd like to thank you for checking out the video. Please subscribe if you haven't already, like and share the video if you enjoyed it. I'm always looking for new and exciting stories, so if you have a scary encounter that has happened to you, please email it to me in the link in my description. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you back here again next time.